Hi, I'm Samantha Fink. The first question I chose to answer was think of an example of an implicit and explicit bias and explain how both of them were shown to you as the viewer. Discuss what both were, the example, and add your analysis of how both interplayed. Through the movie, they demonstrated many different examples of implicit and explicit biases. An example of an implicit bias is when the waiter at the restaurant did not give them as much attention as she was giving all the other tables because she assumed that because of their skin color, they were not going to tip well. Anthony notices and makes a comment to Peter about how they had to wait longer for their food than others, and they never got poured a cup of coffee when she gave everyone around them one. Anthony then does not tip due to the bad service they received. This example shows the implicit bias of her not providing as much attention to their table due to their skin color and the fact that she thought they would not tip well, and how it was responded to with a microaggression of him not tipping the waiter. An example of an explicit bias is when the car crash happened at the very beginning and the lady who hit Ria's car said, quote, "Mexican no know how to drive," end quote. This is explicit bias because the lady blames the crash on Ria by saying that she is Mexican, so she doesn't know how to drive, and the crash was her fault because she braked too fast. Ria's response to this is, quote, "Maybe you see over steering wheel, you Blake too," end quote. She is providing a macroaggression back to the woman, saying that because she is Asian and short, she fits the stereotype. Ria also continues to talk in the lady's accent by copying the way she says Blake instead of break. This demonstrates how the explicit bias the woman made led to Ria creating a macroaggression. The next question I chose to answer was, what seemed contradictory in the film? Explain how you would have handled it if you were the director. What seemed contradictory to me was when there was an implicit bias when Jean grabs her husband's arm after seeing Anthony and Peter. Anthony noticed her do this and pointed it out to Peter, and he said that they must fear them because of their race, even though they are wearing nice clothes and don't appear as they are trying to cause any danger. Then Anthony and Peter both take out their guns and carjack their car. We later learn that Jean didn't realize her actions and says, quote, "If a white woman sees two black men walking towards her and she turns in the other direction, she is a racist, right?" End quote. So this is why she didn't say anything, and she's confused why later on she had a gun in her face. This shows that she never realized her bias. I believe the director of the movie did this in order to get the theme across of how implicit and explicit bias leads to macro and micro aggressions. This shows how the implicit bias of Jean grabbing her husband's arm and how it led to the macro aggression of them carjacking their car. The next question I chose to answer was what stereotypes were addressed in the film and what conclusions were we as viewers supposed to draw from them. There were many different stereotypes addressed in the film. 3 examples of the stereotypes of someone who is Black, Mexican, and Persian. A few examples of when the movie stereotyped someone who is Black was when Jean grabbed her husband's arm when they saw Anthony and Peter, and this shows how she stereotyped them because of their skin color. She thought they were dangerous. However, her implicit bias was responded to with a macroaggression by them carjacking her car. Another example is when the director said Jamal is sounding less Black, and he thinks the audience won't recognize him as being Black. This shows the stereotype of because he is Black that he should sound a certain way. One more example is when John shows up to talk to Shaniqua and he says, quote, "I can't look at you without thinking about the 5 or 6 more qualified white men who didn't get your job," end quote. This would be considered an explicit bias. We learn that he gained this bias as a child, seeing his father's company lose everything when the city council decided to give minority-owned companies preference in city contracts. This demonstrates how he over time gained a bias A few examples of when the movie stereotyped someone who was Mexican is when Jean wanted her locks changed again in the morning. She says, quote, "I would appreciate it is next time they didn't send a gang member." Jean said, "Look at all his tattoos and his shaved head." This shows her implicit bias because she thinks because he is Mexican and has tattoos that he must be in a gang. Another example is when Graham assumes Rhea is Mexican because of the way she looks. This is an implicit bias, and Rhea responds by telling him she is not Mexican and that her parents are from Puerto Rico and El Salvador. A few examples of when the movie stereotyped someone who was Persian was when they were in the gun store and Farhad was speaking a different language, that the worker kicked him out of the store because he thinks that because he cannot speak English well that he must not be a U.S. citizen. And this shows his explicit bias. Another example is when someone broke into Farad's store and wrote on the wall. The mom said, quote, "They think we are Arab. When did Persian become Arab?" End quote. This shows the implicit bias of the person who broke into their shop, that because of the way they looked, that they must be Arab. The next question I chose to answer was choose two characteristics and explain each. I chose Jean and Anthony to explain. They are both two very different characters. Jean is very unconscious about any biases she makes, which causes her to receive macro and microaggressions that she doesn't understand why. And Anthony is very observant about all the biases around him, but he tends to respond with macro and microaggressions. We can tell that Jean is in the upper class, and we know this from seeing her large house and that she has a maid. Some examples of Jean's character include her implicit bias of grabbing her husband's arm when she saw Peter and Anthony walk by, and their response of a macroaggression by stealing her car. And when Jean wants the locks changed again in the morning because she thinks that because he is Mexican and has tattoos and a shaved head, that he is in a gang. We can tell Anthony is in the lower class by seeing where he lives. Anthony tends to respond with macro and microaggressions. An example of this is when he stole Jean's car after she did an implicit bias. Anthony has his own biases by saying Mofat is wrong because he steals from people of their own race, so it's bad. And it's okay that he steals from people because he's stealing from people who are not the same race as him. When Anthony meets Cameron, and Cameron tells Anthony that he embarrasses him, and the reason he embarrasses him is because of his actions that he's feeding into the stereotype. And after his conversation with Cameron, he then changes some things that he does. And you can see this at the end when he frees the people who were in the white truck. The theme of this movie is that implicit and explicit biases tend to be responded with macro and microaggressions, and we saw examples of this throughout the movie.